I'm joined today by Steve Almond, author of Against Football, One Fan's Reluctant Manifesto, which is just out in paperback. The book is super interesting, Steve, and you're an admitted football fan who is sort of trying to rid yourself of football, and you have a number of ethical concerns around the game, which we'll get to. And, in preparing for this interview, I was reminded of an interview I did with the Nation's Dave Zirin around the last World Cup, where he presented all sorts of very strong indictments of FIFA and of World Cups more broadly, but still said he doesn't think it's unethical or immoral to watch because you enjoy the game of soccer, but that you should be simultaneously advocating for change. Now, when it comes to football for you, you feel that that is not an okay solution. In other words, you really need to rid yourself of football, as you say.
Well, I think the book is trying to present the football for what it really is, the biggest central narrative in American culture, the most popular sport, the most profitable sport, the largest activity or narrative that we all have in common. I think it's bigger than religion at this point. It's bigger than the bonds of family in many cases. And I'm really interested in what it means, both as a phenomenally interesting game narrative, and also maybe even as almost like a spiritual thing for a lot of people, but also what the dark side of it is. So the book isn't trying to say you should do this or you should do that, but you should know exactly what it is you're sponsoring when you sit down to watch a game. And I think that's the place where I do depart from somebody like Dave Zirin, although I really appreciate how intelligently he writes about sports and how morally grounded he is as a commentator. I think it's very basic. Roger Goodell and the folks who run the big college football programs and the whole football industrial complex, they don't care whether you're guilt-stricken. They don't care whether you are sort of cheering with a big foam rubber hand in one hand and maybe with a fist advocating with the other, because they're really keeping score in a very basic way. Are you a sponsor? Are you tuning in? Are you contributing to the revenues of big football? And the answer is yes. If you're a fan, that's what you're doing. But that's my answer. There are a lot of people who are going to read the book and say, well, I might cut back on my consumption, or I might become more active and involved when it comes to questioning how my tax dollars are spent at the level of high school or pro or college football. So it's not trying to advocate any one solution like boycott football. It's much more, hey, you should think about what everything that football is, because it's extraordinarily complicated and it's woven through the fabric of almost everything we do in America at this point.
Give us the sort of bullet points of what these areas of concern are. And then, I have some that I'm going to want to dive into. The ones
Sure.
that to me strike me are, of course, this pervasive brain injury disaster and systematic cover up that has been exposed several times now.
Right.
And how that impacts how we see college football and even high school football, really.
Right.
The corporatism, no question about that. The greed, which some write off as sort of billionaires versus millionaires, which is not at all the reality, as Dave Zirin has exposed when we look at owners versus players. What else is there?
Well, I think there are things that are a little bit squishier and more subtle, but the major thing is that you have to accept that you're watching a form of entertainment in which you incur none of the risk and in which up to a third of the pro players are going to get brain damage. That's the big one that, for me, having seen my mom suffer a cognitive collapse, basically, I just kind of turned my stomach. But beyond that and beyond the sort of the greed that's just sort of built into American capitalist culture, are issues that have to do with the way that masculinity is defined and femininity, the way that sort of gender and orientation work. And I think the main thing that really troubled me, the more I thought about two things really, the way in which football has become inextricably linked to the educational process in this country at the high school and college level. That just makes no sense to me, that a game that essentially segregates people and values them purely for their physical worth, and that also clearly now the research indicates has deleterious effects on people's brain function, somehow are a huge part of our educational system and the tax dollars that are spent on it. And the other thing is that it really sanitizes and normalizes violence. I think in this way it's symptomatic of American culture. But the thing about football that just makes it distinct from something like rugby or especially boxing is we really come to believe, as when we watch football, we allow a certain kind of magical thinking to infect us. We honestly think that a 280-pound player who comes up against another 300-pound player, with 70 G forces, maybe 100 times a game, isn't going to be permanently damaged and maybe even brain damaged by that contact. We allow ourselves to believe that it's not real violence. And I think that abstracting of what real violence is and its real human toll is the same mentality that's in operation when, for instance, we send soldiers overseas and they suffer whatever they suffer. And then when they come back to the United States, we just aren't particularly interested in their suffering.
Do you think that, well, let me frame it a different way. There's many people I know who, if I said to them, football really has this inherent tolerance for what are debilitating brain injuries to a significant percentage of the players. Football really has this tolerance for this total corporatism. Football tolerates even arguably homophobia and even racism in some cases, blah, blah, blah. And they would look at me and with a totally straight face, they would say, David, I know what you're saying, but
Right.
I just like watching the game. I don't believe any of those things, and watching the game isn't going to change my opinion. Is
Right.
that a valid defense in your mind, or are you legitimizing those problems merely by watching?
I don't know that you're legitimizing them. I think you're consuming and really in that way kind of taking part in a game that has certain values that we really would never condone outside the realm of football. That's what's so amazing about football. It's such a remarkable spectacle. It's so thrilling, and our attachment to it is so deep that we essentially throw whatever moral qualms we might have out as citizens, as parents, as maybe even as people of faith, those go out the window. If you think about how Jesus would regard the Jesus I'm talking about, sort of the Sermon on the Mount, who was turn the other cheek, avoid violence.
Right, not the evangelical right-wing Jesus.
Well, right, the guy who was, turning over the money changers' tables, who was a radical who believed in the gospel of love as a revolutionary force.
Yeah.
That Jesus would look at football and say, oh, I recognize that. The nearest cognate I have is the spectacles that the Romans throw, these gladiatorial combats where there's clear bloodlust, there's a clear effort to distract the people from incompetent venal leadership and from a kind of injustice that I am my whole mission is to put across, that we've got to be more merciful and kind and less violent towards one another. A lot of people would say they believe in what Jesus said on the Mount, and then they would, watch a football game, and when a running back scores a touchdown by knocking the linebacker senseless and says, thank God, I'm glad, I believe in God, and I'm glad he was watching over this gridiron, they would
Right.
see no sense of cognitive dissonance. But in this sense, David, it's really, it's more typical of an American human, but especially an American mindset. That is, we love certain pleasures in this culture, but we don't like interrogating those pleasures morally. It's very unpleasant. We all love bacon, or most of us do, but we certainly have no interest in going to the slaughterhouse. What my book is attempting to do is to say, look, I loved football for 40 years as a sport and as a spectacle. It's ecstatic and beautiful. It's the body at play. It's greatness and poise and discipline and teamwork and all these virtues, many of them manly, but still virtues that are nothing but laudable. And also, while you're consuming all that, there's also this other stuff. And this other stuff is really, you're a part of the larger system that fosters that. You talked about homophobia as like maybe the NFL is homophobic. It's not a maybe. When you have a collective freak out at the idea that a single gay employee is going to enter your workforce,
Right.
that's just, when you look at any other workplace, we would never accept that. Maybe the Catholic Church or an evangelical business, but we would never accept that in most other realms of our life. Just like we would never accept a workplace where the ownership says, yeah, 30% of the employees are going to get long-term cognitive ailments, but what are you going to do? It's just they incur the risk. They know what they're doing. We don't watch coal miners get black lung, right? But we could all recognize that it was a real problem and the workplace needed to change. We are actually watching the coal miners get black lung. That's what we're doing every Sunday. We're watching guys who are getting brain damage, and we're seeing some of them take their own lives or sort of suffer in silence years later. And we're saying collectively and individually, I'm okay with that.
And have you successfully stayed away from watching football the first 3 weeks of the current season?
I have to say I have, but it's not easy because, it, you know, because I am a sports fan, I check to see, what's going on with the baseball team I follow, and are there any interesting highlights? And also, sports is on everywhere. It's sort of the national wallpaper, and I do notice that my team, the long suffering Oakland Raiders, seem to somehow miraculously not be doing terribly. In fact, doing surprisingly well. So now the real challenge comes in. It's
Yeah.
not when your team is lousy and you turn away. It's when your team is doing great and you then have to turn away. And I just want to say, it's not like I'm loving it or just sitting there going, oh, well, what a dumb game. And I can't believe I ever watched it. I
Yeah.
know exactly why I watched it. It's unbelievably alluring. And all my book is trying to do is say, what is it like when you have to walk away from something you really love? Because you learn so much about it that you realize there's a lot of unlovable parts to it that are sort of infecting you without you entirely realizing it.
Let me remind everybody the book is called Against Football, One Fan's Reluctant Manifesto. It's now out in paperback. We've been speaking with the book's author, Steve Almond. Thank you so much for telling us about it.
Absolutely. Thank you.